Just take their seat so we can get started. Okay, so good morning everyone. Thanks all for being here. We've reached the final panel of this 3-day conference. Made our way here. There's been some very interesting papers, a lot of thought-provoking discussions that have happened. Hope to continue the same with this panel, which is called the Periphery and the Future of Urbanization. So my name is Sudeshna Mitra, and I'm faculty here at IHS. And we have a panel here of five panelists here. And I just want to take a couple of minutes in the beginning and just talk a little bit about what the idea was in sort of pulling this panel together. And there were a lot of responses to this panel. So there's obviously, it's sort of, a lot of people responded to the larger framing that was there in this panel. So the term periphery, in the way that the call framed it, is, I mean, even if we start thinking about the geographic periphery of a city, then studies that sort of grapple with the dynamics of urban transition that are occurring in these geographic peripheries often characterize it in relation to the city itself. And the challenge in these kinds of comparison is to sort of hold and acknowledge the relationality without falling into a binary of the periphery being described in sort of a way that it's a negative space or it's not the city. And so if we sort of unpack the idea of that kind of a binary, then there are at least two ways that we can sort of take that apart. That one is, there is an assumed coherence of both structures and processes that an urban possesses, which a peri-urban does not. Right? That's probably one way to think about it. And the second is that there is a focus on looking at the practices that are playing out in the peripheries and seeing them as exceptional to the rules of law which are applicable in the urban, or actually in most cases some kind of an imagined urban, because rules of law themselves are not being applied in any, and we can sort of go into that. So if we sort of, so those are some of the problems of kind of this kind of idea of an exception or the negative space idea of binary. So the common thematic that runs through the 5 papers on this panel is therefore to attempt to name, to hold, and to understand the multiple ways of agencies, processes, as well as the structures themselves of urbanization that are playing out. So the idea of the periphery in some of the papers is in terms of the peri-urban as a site. In some of the papers, the idea of the periphery is as a positionality, that it is a way to sort of look at the multiplicities rather than a linear trajectory or one imagination of an urbanization process. And in some of the papers, there is both the idea of the site as well as the positionality. So without, just to sort of go through some of the logistics of the thing, we have 15 minutes per panel. We will do a consolidated question and answer session at the end of the panel, because again the idea would be to maybe have some of the papers speak to one another in terms of this sort of unpacking this idea of the periphery itself. Amog has very kindly agreed to help us keep to time, so he will give the 5-minute and the 2-minute intimations to the presentations. So, and I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves and their papers. That would be really helpful.
can I just sort of get my thing up? Okay, that's it. And I have to go to good morning. Happy to be here. My name is Karen Coelho, and I'm from the Madras Institute of Development Studies in Chennai. And I'm going to get right to it because we don't have much time. I wanted to start with this visual that actually shows you two different kinds of urban built space. There's the settlement of Calcutta in the foreground and a tech park in the background, and they're both on the southern periphery of Chennai in the IT park, the IT corridor. And then you have this place, which is called Rotary Nagar, and it also looks kind of definitively peripheral to me, but it's really in, I was going to try to signal, and it's right here in the middle of the city, right? So, so I'm asking then, what does periphery mean, and what can this terminology of periphery actually give us in terms of a purchase on the spatial politics of the city? So in this paper, I'm proposing that urban waterways, so I'm sort of going out on a limb here to propose this, that urban waterways constitute a type of intra-urban periphery, giving rise to distinctive forms of urbanism that I'm calling water's edge urbanism. And so what you're getting here, I'm proposing is a kind of an edge city, to use Caldera's term, and elsewhere to dominant process of city making, which yet nevertheless play a key role in maintaining the peripherality of these spaces. So the dominant processes are playing a role in maintaining. I'm suggesting that these are places where distinct processes of urbanization can be traced over time, from spontaneous settling to slow, incrementally produced buildings, spaces of residence, livelihood, economies, cultures, and then further, almost inevitably, to contestation and struggle against various forms of appropriations, enclosures, and threats, including of pollution and insanitary conditions from the waterway itself. So here let me invoke Caldera's recent writing on peripheral urbanism, which I think it resonates a lot with what I've been seeing in recent work I've been doing. For Caldera, the peripheral urbanism is not about spatial location and not necessarily or mainly about marginality. It's instead a mode of production of space which has three sort of main important characteristics. One is that this mode, it's auto-constructed, that is, the spaces and infrastructure are built from the ground up by residents rather than being consumed as ready-made spaces, as ready-made commodities. Second, it engages with official logics of capital, property, law, economy, but in a transversal and not direct fashion, because typically these are excluded from the formal circuits of these logics. And third, it generates new kinds of politics, new citizenship claims, and there are two other important points that Caldera makes about this. That peripheral urbanism produces highly heterogeneous spaces and is marked by inequality and precarity. And second, crucially, that it is a dynamic scene where there is constant, if often slow, change and transformation, and sometimes this temporality changes and there's rapid transformation. But so this transformation is both in terms of enhancement and improvement of the built space, of the quality of the built space, and consequent to this, a displacement and a reproduction of peripheral urbanism elsewhere as the displaced spaces are taken over by external actors. So, the edges of waterways. This is where urban life is seeded, as we all know, and formed for working class communities, primarily due to the open nature of these lands. And they're open both in revenue terms, as sort of Porambok common lands that are not pursued by the elite because they're looking for land that can be purchased as secure property. But they're also open in ecological terms, in that they are uninhabited, untamed, unsuitable for settlement by any but the most desperate, who then expend considerable effort in taming these lands, building up bunds, fighting off snakes, concretizing the slush and mud into homes, workshops, and temples. But as we learned in our work, these processes of urbanization are not linear. They're not sort of linear historical narratives of greenfield sites that get urbanized steadily. Rather, there is a reiterative cycle of production, appropriation, destruction, of settling, uprooting and moving, resettling, being resettled. So different forms and drives of urbanization, I argue, are played out along these borderlands in the interstices between state visions, plans, and then their failures of implementation, their so-called failures of implementation and governance. So I argue that urban river and canal banks are zones of contest between their typical histories of squatting and auto-construction, and then the multiple other visions, plans and schemes that they invariably invoke. But I think that the water's edge as periphery adds the ecological dimension to Caldera's formulation of peripheral urbanism. Because these sites, I think, become subject to environmental questions, which become important, the environmental question, I would say, which becomes important at particular points in time. So there's a couple of things that I've learned, over the course of some work on waterways that I've done for some time. First is that much of the untold stories and histories of cities are concealed along their waterways. And second, I've learned how powerfully, politically powerful the rhetoric and the discourses of eco-restoration are for various and quite diverse projects of legitimation and rule. So if you take the Ganga or the Yamuna and the Sabarmati, or even in Nepal, the river Bagmati, and all of these, if you read about them, you realize that these are projects that are laying out certain sort of claims to legitimation and rule, and certain sort of state formation kinds of projects. So I think that, but I also think that urban waterways and water bodies carry strong semiotic power even for urban residents, from memories of better times, nostalgic sort of recollections, to visions of world-class recreational spaces, as Balaji was pointing out yesterday. So Chennai's Buckingham Canal, that's where I'm sort of citing some of these, propositions. I think it offers a productive geography from which to try and theorize urban transitions in Indian metropolitan cities. Like other urban waterways, it has undergone shifting valuations in the city's urbanization schemes over its history. Built in the 1980s by the British as a navigation channel to transport freight down the eastern corridors of the Madras Presidency, its operations right from the beginning were very fragile and tenuous and threatened, challenged by many sort of environmental things like tidal action and storm surges. By the 1950s, navigation had substantially declined in the canal, and the canal degenerated into a sort of choked and dysfunctional urban drain. Indeed, until the 1970s, the banks were just a backyard mess, the backyard of the city. But in the 1980s, the canal alignment was identified as a tract of readily available open land on which to construct the MRTS, the Mass Rapid Transit System, an elevated roadway that was constructed along, as you can see, the alignment of the canal for most of its length. And then in the current millennium, you see the canal inserted into new imaginaries of cycle paths, walking paths, waterfront parks, and a growing discourse about its important drainage function for the city. But there are other histories of this canal that are overlooked by these accounts. Since its origins, the canal has hosted a steadily expanding complex of informal settlements, small-scale industrial complexes, offering workers and their families a foothold within the city. And by 1960, as you see, the Buckingham Canal was identified as the single largest concentrated site of slums in the city, accounting for 10% of the city's slums. So from the windows of this elevated corridor that runs along the canal, you see an exuberant water's edge city, densely built up in, this is the picture from the MRTS, brightly painted and full of what Simone calls the missing majority, large numbers of unaccounted for, uncategorized, invisible urban denizens. But from the inside, these spaces reveal histories of behind-the-scene urbanizations within neglected spaces. These are, again, the backyards of governance, where dynamic circuits of wealth generation and social mobility operate within settings of precarious labor and poverty. These intermediate, indeterminate, liminal spaces, I argue, are crucial for understanding both the possibilities and the specific character of the urban as it plays out in different sites along the ground. It reveals diverse ways in which the urban is constituted within the bounds of a single city, both as a process of becoming for subaltern groups and as a territorial complex of colliding visions and projects. From undervalued and neglected hinterlands, squatted and slummed, to aspirational world-class waterfronts. These spaces, I say, are metonymic of larger transformations in metropolitan spatial politics. So in terms of the specific conditions of water's edge urbanism, I think they're about, as I've been mentioning, shifting trajectories of opportunity, threat, and challenge. It is about how the urban experience is constituted in a certain convergence of three sorts of operations. Multiple modes of production of space by squatters, entrepreneurs, etc. Specific modes of governance of the waterways and their banks, and relationships between residents and their waterways, inflected by an intensifying vulnerability to polluted waters, as well as to threats of eviction and relocation to the urban peripheries. So, as urban waterways become central to projects of world classing, all settlements on their banks become increasingly drawn into these shifting dynamics of spatial valorization, from development and gentrification to eviction and displacement, which in turn, I think, shape the strategies of placemaking in these neighborhoods. So I'm just, my framing here is responding to two preoccupations of Southern theories of urbanism. One is that they're interested in the expanded landscapes, the peri-urban corridors. We heard a lot about those in previous days. And I'm bringing the focus back to the intra-urban, showing how the banks of waterways are not just a seam within the city, but also a corridor linking these multiple settlements along, a waterway. And a second preoccupation, which is about worlding. I'm showing here that the concern of residents is less with worlding than with entrenching, with advancing the project of becoming urban through consolidating claims to very localized territorial relations. So the concept of entrenchment, I'm saying here, outlines an arc of striving from the claiming and taming of these neglected hinterlands through sort of labor and auto construction and stealthy encroachment and all of that, to struggles to remain and to entrench these occupancies as waterfront territories become coveted frontage for various infrastructure developments. So employing multi-sited ethnography in 3 sites along the canal, I'm going to just talk a little bit about each site to just show you the range of urbanisms that are played out here. So the northern settlement of Wood Wharf, what you're seeing is a sort of a very dense manufacturing, small-scale industrial hub that gets formed out of the wharves and the loading docks that serviced the operations of the canal in its heyday. In 1950s, the PWD leased out lands on the canal for commercial operations like warehouses, godowns, sheds, and these got leveraged by Marwadi capital in the 1970s to create these very, very dense sort of small-scale industrial operations, mainly polishing of steel and aluminium, fabricating and polishing of steel and aluminium goods of various kinds. So the area now hosts a buzzing, industry with intense multipliers and linkages, directly employing thousands of workers and indirectly also a huge sort of livelihood network of logistics suppliers and transport and different centers and all of this. And since nobody has title, there is very little vertical build-up. The area is pretty congested. Conditions are very rough because there's no sanitation, and you have homes along these very noisy workshops, etc. But residents asserted really embraced this area that they lived in, said it had provided for 2 generations of their, and embraced the diversity of this place where Marwadi businessmen operated side by side with Christian evangelists, etc. And they send their children to school in English medium, etc. And so I think this is a very distinctive type of urbanism that you see here. A second set of settlements that you find along the, might need a couple extra minutes. A second set of settlements in the central area, Mylapore, Triplicane, reveals a landscape of solidly built up neighborhoods that I think provide a history of the contests over housing and slum clearance in the city. So some represent the slum clearance board tenements that were built up in the 1970s. I think testifying to an era when the government was willing to allocate center city lands to accommodate working class families. So I think very distinctive moment there. But most communities resisted these schemes and instead demanded titles for the lands they occupied. This moment was when the World Bank funded MUDP was rolling out, which was giving in-situ slum upgrading projects. And so many succeeded in retaining their land. Through decades of incremental improvement, these settlements have morphed into very solid urban neighborhoods where the 60s generation of unskilled manual laborers have found socioeconomic mobility, educated their children, integrated themselves into the white-collar service economies of this area. And the third settlement, oh, this is the same one. And the third settlement of Neelangarai, which is on the southern edges of the city, so was sort of outside the city lately, represents a second generation squatting, where people already settled in as renters in the city move out in search of property to own, reenacting the cycle of taming rural lands for urbanization. Here, squatting is not aimed at shelter or at getting a foothold in a livelihood landscape, but it is about a bid to own land as property. It's about entering the dominant landscapes of real estate. So here you track the evolution of a sort of a, from, this is all about the auto construction. And despite the fact that nobody here has pattas, you see this place is a far cry from a slum with a neat row of concrete houses. Most of the facilities they need are there. Here too, education and employment have been really increased. Most of the youth work along the IT corridor. Rental incomes are a significant source of income. The neighborhood hosts a growing constellation of northeastern workers as renters. Here, however, the crux of the project of entrenchment is about getting a patta, which residents feel will bestow respectability and decency to the neighborhood and will propel the area into multi-story development with expanded potential for rentals. And I just need literally 1 minute more to finish because I have just 2 little points to make. How did the canal figure in these transformations? What did it mean to these communities? Over the years, the canal that attracted the people to settle there and provided all the conditions of their basic sustenance has now become no more than a nuisance, a sore, a source of pollution and ill health, the most marked feature of their slum-like conditions. Basically, so there are some older residents who recollect, memories of playing along the banks, etc. But for most people, most of these communities have turned their backs to the canal. It is a space for their effluents, for their wastes. And the newcomers, the most vulnerable, are those who settle right along its banks. So just the last thing is about what are the implications? So what? What are the implications of this framing that I'm offering? And I think there are several, but I'm just going to talk about 3 quickly. First, I think the corridor character of these peripheries, whether they're seashores, lakes, canal banks, or river banks, signal a politics of scale and connection. For example, the need to challenge the scapegoating of local communities for pollution that is generated much further upriver. So that would be one way of looking at scale and connections. And also the need to forge connections along these corridors for similar kinds of struggles that they're facing. Second, it highlights the politics of eco-restoration as not something that we all should be really happy about, but cannot be, because it's a whole lot of conflicts over worth and value between a particular set of environmental values and those of the histories and spaces produced over generations by settlers. And I think here the openings in this politics is to resist this being posed as a trade-off between environment and the subaltern right to the city, but to really, frame this as a convergence in some way. That I think is the work to be done. And third, of course, and I'm just going to put it in one line because there's a lot that can be talked about it, is to recreate these lands as commons rather than as enclosed for particular groups of people. Thank you. I took only 1 minute extra.
Hello everyone, I am Chavi. I come from Department of HSS from IIT Bombay, and this paper that I am presenting is a small part of my PhD work that I have been carrying on for 3.5 years now. And to start on, I titled it as Mumbai City in Flux as seen through its taxi sector. So to just put out a historical context, taxis in Bombay started off as metered taxis. They started way back in 1909. So metered taxis that we see, which everybody knows as Kali Pili taxis or black and yellow taxis, they are a century-old trait, and they were right from the beginning. In every government document, we can see that the public service and the public utility foundational principle is emphasized in every news report, in every government document. So that has been the structuring principle for the taxi trade of the city. It was launched almost just 1.5 years after London got its motor cab, and the model was largely the same. However, in both the places, public service was the foundational principle, and because it was public service oriented service, so what it led to was that the fares were regulated. The entire service was regulated in terms of fares being regulated. There were permits being issued. Each driver had to carry a license. There was a separate badge which is issued till date, and it is called Public Service Vehicle Authorization Badge. The vehicles, meters, drivers, everything is checked on an annual basis. There were designated taxi stands, there were designated routes that were given, and even now there's a designated area where they can ply, and as per the fares that are given to them. There's a strict code of conduct for drivers. There are heavy penalties for violations. Right of drivers are mentioned in just a line or two, and they're very, very limited. Even in terms of how they're implemented, it's always on a case-to-case basis. Earlier, even in terms of lights and interiors of the cabs, were actually given down, because when the service started, there was always this two categories. There was a first class taxi and a second class taxi, which eventually gave way to a uniform Kali Pili taxi or a black and yellow taxi. In terms of regulatory control, up till 1940, taxi trade was monitored by a Commissioner of Police Office. And with the enactment of Indian Motor Vehicles Act in 1939, it passed on to RTA, Regional Transport Authority. And even now, in terms of any kind of policy deliberations, putting up committees, ad hoc committees for fare revisions, it is this authority under the executive branch of the government that takes into account any kind of revision or any kind of updating that has to be implemented in the taxi trade. So as I mentioned that earlier, it started, when it started in 1909, it started as a fleet service, and there were two motor cab companies that were running it. One was Indian Motor Cab Company, and I think the other one was Sunbeam. And they used to have drivers driving for them, and these companies were largely owned by the British. But gradually, over a period of time, and there were many transitions, like there were at one point of time, first class taxis went off. After a certain point of time, light taxis were introduced, and there were baby taxis that were introduced. And there was a lot of disjunction, conflict, contestation at each and every stage. But however, over a period of time, coming up to almost 1945 around, we see this a very, very uniform opinion forming in the union, taxi unions, as well as the state authority, that it is best that taxi permits and taxi drivers are actually the owners of the of the permits and of the vehicles, because that according to the state was a very effective measure to ensure accountability and answerability. And that is why now the Kali Pili taxi drivers, or even the cool cabs, which are the metered AC variants, one largely finds self-employed drivers, though there are usually one person who would be driving it on rent on a different shift. And that's again, it's a written down agreement, it's a regulated thing. Taxi trade has always been a mix of formal and informal, and I really can't get into this right now. And another thing that is very central to taxi trade right from the time it started is migration, and it has continued up till now, and there's a certain pattern that can be seen in it. In terms of the present context, right now in Bombay city, in Mumbai city, there are four different types of cabs that one can see: metered cabs, Kali Pili, or the cool cabs. T-permit cabs, which were tourist permit cabs, which were initially only thought of as intercity travel, but that was never really followed. And their penetration into the city has been rapid over the last 2-3 years, if I can say that. Fleet taxis were introduced in 2007, again by the state through a different act altogether. And so what one can see is that metered, T-permit and fleet taxis, all these three types of taxis have different regulatory arrangement. However, they continue to be regulated by the state very closely. Last 2.5 years saw the entry of aggregator run cabs, which are Ola cabs and Uber. Now what they have been proposing is that they have been the disruptors in the taxi economy and the taxi sector of the city. And till date, they continue to be outside the legal infrastructure. In terms of they do not have permits, they do not own vehicles. In terms of fare calculations, it is their algorithms that are determining fare calculations, depending on at least 4 or 5 major variables. And even in terms of recruitment of drivers, nobody knows how it really happens, and it is a totally fluid way in which it goes. And now what I want to talk in detail about is that what are the violations that have been happening with the entry of the aggregators, and how is it that they get an upper hand despite all the violations that have been happening. So a broad classification was that there are institutional violations and then there are violations at the macro level. And when I talk about the micro violations at the, these are largely as put by one of the taxi drivers, who was earlier a taxi driver and is now actually a professor in the city of Bombay. He said that what these people have done is they have disrupted the level playing field at a considerable scale, which has not been seen in the city till now. So in terms of institutional, as I said before, they do not carry any permit. None of the drivers have actually public service authorization badge. So again, accounting for any kind of mishap becomes a difficult cycle, and there's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to determining who is to be held accountable and answerable for any kind of major violation or accident involved. They run on T-permit cabs, they do not own, and T-permit cabs do not have any upper limit. So the entire regulatory logic behind at one point of time sealing the Kali Pili or the metered permits were that if there are too many cabs in the city, it would lead to traffic snarls, it would lead to pollution. So this regulatory logic stands challenged if there is no check on the number of taxis that are actually being pumped into the system right now. Initially, it was heavily reported, though I never came across any case of this kind, that the cabs were diesel or petrol run and not the CNG one, which is a mandatory thing. And they run on dynamic pricing. Now, fares for metered taxis have always been determined after a very long process, even if it has like in the pre-independence time, when the hike was only say for 1 anna, even then a committee used to sit and the deliberations used to go on for at least 2.5 or 3 months. And it was only then, whether it is a 1 anna hike or a 1 rupee hike, the deliberation is long, and there are many factors that are taken into account, from inflation, the driver's perspective, and what actually rides the most in any kind of decision making is the passenger's perspective. Now all that again stands challenged, and it can be questioned. We don't know right now. It seems to be working for the benefit of passengers, but how it works for the benefit of passengers I will tell in the coming slides. In terms of the micro violations, people have been, like taxi drivers say that drivers driving for Uber and Ola are all Nalla drivers, which they basically want to say that they do not own the badge, which is actually a determiner for them. It is a marker of good conduct, and also something that because it has a unique number, you can be immediately traced. And again, so the tracing part becomes difficult. They always say that they cannot use mobiles. Individuals driving vehicles cannot drive mobiles, but these drivers are constantly on the mobile phones, navigating in the city, and nobody really stops them, whether it's the traffic police. It hasn't been brought up at the policy level. There are no uniforms for them, there are no taxi stands for them, so they can be found parking there, enough and more violations to that. But these are the micro violations, are the things that have been talked about by the taxi drivers, and what they really point out is that somewhere they feel cheated by the state. So according to me, what gives aggregators an upper hand, for me I have just classified it in terms of 4 categories. One is the legal vacuum, global finance and its networks, discourse creation, and ad hoc ways of functioning. In terms of legal vacuum, perceived or real, I initially mentioned that they all entered at a time when there was no law regulating them. There still isn't. However, at one point of time, one official in the RTO told me, and I'll quote, what the legal infrastructure provides at the time is called agent's license. Canvassing passengers for a transport vehicle, strictly speaking, if one has to put Ola and Uber into some existing category, operators, then it would be this category. They are canvassing passengers and tying them up with drivers. But do they have a license? The answer is no. And so in this case, The thing is that they claim themselves, Ola and Uber, they claim themselves to be aggregators, and they bring in a certain kind of language and they bring in a certain kind of discourse with them, which is being actually not critically looked at. It is being accepted by the state, and that is how they are going ahead with it. Even in terms of deployment of PR machinery, which they have to constantly tackle when it comes to enforcing any kind of rules. So there were in 2015 and 2016, there were 2 different draft regulations that came in, which have till now not been really become rules and acts. And to the 2015 regulation, at one point of time, Uber was wanting to mobilize a certain public opinion against it, and it read like this: that a step backwards for Mumbai, speak up for Uber in Mumbai. If this scheme is passed, it is going to challenge the way you, the rider, can Uber. So linking with the next thing that I would talk about in terms of discourse creation and language, I would want to say that you, the rider, can Uber. So Uber has become almost equivalent to an activity of commute, which is very central to any city and any city life. And again, so everybody thinks that something to do with taxi drivers at one point of time used to be a very executive decision. It was taken by the executive branch of the government. There was a committee that used to come in place, and then whatever it used to propose, that used to be deliberated, and then it used to be passed. Now, all the taxi drivers, most of them that I have spoken to, they all say that no more is it an executive decision, but it's actually a political decision, and somewhere they feel that Modi's agenda of tying up of smart cities gets tied up, and the entire thing of global cities, smart cities, gets tied up to this aspiration of having more of Uber and Ola. And somewhere Uber and Ola are actually able to posit themselves as solution providers to traffic snarls, to providing them data. So it is very intelligent how, it's in a very intelligent and a very strategic way, they are actually able to flip their entire violations to be actually taken into account as something that they can be solution providers, and that is where the government needs to that's why the government needs to hear them out. And in any kind of platform, I'm sorry, I'm just rushing through because I have very little time and I have a lot of things remaining. In terms of global finance, now global finance, I argue, it is evident, this is what actually drives all the dynamic pricing. That is how they are right now able to incentivize the driver partners, and that is how they address their drivers. They always address their drivers as driver partners. Now what is the reality of it is again something that I would argue is that a discourse, when it reveals something, it also conceals something. So as social practitioners, and in academics, we need to look at any kind of discourse creation with a certain element of criticality. So global finance, I have put in some of the data here, where Uber has been like the biggest startup that the world has seen till now in terms of loss making or in terms of the money it has been able to raise. And the geographic locations of venture capitalist funds that are funding Uber's growth and Ola's growth is something to be taken note of. They are largely located in New York, Britain, Tokyo, hedge funds of Russia, and the latest fundraising of Uber actually got $3 billion from Saudi Arabia sovereign wealth funds. So here I would like to, in my paper I actually talk about finance, and I structure it through the argument that Saskia Sassen puts in, that finance is a capability. It is an assemblage of very powerful actors, technologies and governance mechanisms, and we have to take into account all that goes behind into functioning of a very local cab that was till now a very locally embedded commute mechanism, whether it is local embeddedness in terms of the finance, in terms of the economic mechanism, in terms of the social structures it has worked in. And because finance comes with a very massive trail, it is never a non-profit generating model. It is a highly profit generating model, because every time money is lent, it is lent on very long-term high return clauses. What somewhere global finance also allows them, this kind of deep pocket and backing from very powerful finance, allows Uber and Ola actually to be somewhere kind of the paradigm setters for how the policy should be made. So for example, at one point of time, Travis Kalanick mentioned in one of his very recent interviews that we are okay till the time state proposes rules which are not backward looking. Suddenly with their discourse creation, they are actually able to posit that whatever rules that have existed till now are something that actually give away a sense of obsoleteness, and that is why we need to do away with them. And here what I again talk about is another aspect of global finance was that in terms of competition, a competition is never just for the drivers or the passengers. It's also a war, literally a war on getting who can get the maximum cash. Can I take 1 more minute? Just a minute. To structure it in terms of theory, I have used Saskia Sassen heavily, and largely our 4 latest works ranging from 2002 to 2014. I won't get into all that. And for discourse, I have used Foucault and some works of Potter and Wetherell and Van Dyck. And what I really want to talk of in this is that they have come in and they have introduced a vocabulary of technology jargons like disruption, aggregators, and they definitely mark themselves out as agents who are always seen in Indian economy as just some kind of middlemen who are under the gaze of state all the time. They're working in the interstices of state functioning. And there's always a sense of subservience with the state. And this is why they definitely would not like to be called as agent. In fact, the state has never looked at them like as agents. And very recently now, Didi Kwaidi's owner, which is now called Didi Chuksing, they have started to call themselves as big data companies, and that is what Uber and Didi Chuksing actually promote themselves as. So what I wanted to really bring out from the entire discourse part was that every time a discourse is created, it reveals something and it conceals. So what is it that it is concealing here? So it conceals the kind of expulsions that it will bring in. And when I talk about expulsion, I'm again borrowing from Saskia Sassen. And in terms of expulsion, it expels the city public who doesn't own the skills, who doesn't have the kind of money to use these kind of apps, own this kind of mobile phone. The very idea of driver partner, when it comes to looking at driver as a driver partner, it seems as if that person is somebody almost as equal to this company. If not almost as equal, but yeah, definitely not like, they want to posit driver partners vis-a-vis the Kalibili drivers who, for one point of them, are arbitrary, but in this kind of context, they are looked at as like an underdog. Now what driver partner does is, what it is concealing is that every time their technology jargon is that because taxi, moving around in a taxi can be unsafe, a driver can take you anywhere. So what you do is that there's a constant surveillance and you can the entire trust has been shifted on from the man occupying the driver's seat onto the technology. So somewhere it belittles the entire trust factor that was always very central to the Kali Pili taxi drivers, or in general the taxi drivers. So what I want to say is that it conceals a lot. Just 30 seconds and I'll finish. And yeah, Uber, and another thing is that when we talk about discourse, we need to look at the contextual information, access and setting. So where is it that they use the word disrupting? It's always in media conferences. And when Travis Kalanick was actually talking in a Startup India event, which was being chaired by Narendra Modi, all the growth that he talked about was in terms of organic growth and how he's empowering the local people, which could be also a part of, a small part of the story, but the larger part of the story, which they always claim is disruption, though a very re-signified disruption, which I've tried to critically look at in my paper. In terms of discussion, this is what I largely wanted to bring out, that coming together of legal vacuum, global finance discourse creation, and ad hoc manner of operations, this combination is actually challenging the existing trade, its very fabric in the city, state's role as upholder of public good, and the very idea of public service. Thank you.
I could ask Sudeshna.
Yeah, good afternoon. The title of my presentation is Emerging Water Dynamics and Insecurities in Peri-urban Hyderabad, Implications for Policy and Governance. Well, the three main components of this paper is, of course, water dynamics in peri-urban, the insecurities, and last but not the least, the policy and the governance aspect. Well, before I actually move ahead, I'd like to give a very, very brief understanding. We know that peri-urban is an area of transition between rural and urban. It is a growing phenomena, and it is sort of now in the Indian context, it is taking more getting more importance. Yeah, so it is not, it is now receiving more importance, but it did start in the 1960s in the US. And, but the problem is that we have sort of given it a name, but we are still trying to sort of give it importance, you know, in the context of governance and policies. So my paper basically tries to look at that aspect, because when we talk about water dynamics, peri-urban is now becoming an area where not only land is being acquired for various kinds of development processes, like, you know, you kind of range it from gated communities to up to SEZs and industrial complexes, IT parks, etc. But additionally, what is also happening is a you know, grabbing of water bodies, and that is, there are multiple kind of dynamics that goes into it, is in terms of understanding the peri-urban, in terms of understanding or identifying water bodies as something very important, and where, I mean, why is it important and what is it important for. So basically we are kind of there are so many stakeholders in the peri-urban area that these dynamics are like really fluid. So I'm going to actually, in my paper, I'm trying to look at those and then trying to identify where the policy and governance is lacking and what needs to be probably taken care of. So with that, I begin my presentation. Yeah, so basically a peri-urban definition has two main aspects: a physical or a geographical entity, where we say it is a flows-based kind of a concept, where we are looking at flows of produce, flows of finance, and flows of labor and services. So basically flows of produce, we've always heard that peri-urban is kind of an area where, from where you get all your vegetables that come into the city markets. That is one. And finance, of course, like that sort of depends, because that's kind of an both way kind of a scenario, because you have people coming to work, so you know, they earn and they take it back to the those areas, to those fringe areas. And of course labor and services, because these laborers are coming into the city, they can be working in the, they could also be working as construction laborers in the peri-urban areas or even in the urban areas itself. So, and then of course, a very basic characteristic of a peri-urban area is the mixed land use. So we see agricultural fields, they are kind of located interspaced with huge gated enclaves, industrial parks, etc. And because of this mixed land use, basically what is happening is we see a lot of non-conforming sort of development that is happening. There is no sort of specific planning that goes into it, primarily because it is not part of the specific urban system. So there are no building regulations per se, except the new developments that come up, which sort of have planning within themselves but not really outside. So there are no entities which are really looking at sort of planning the other areas apart from the ones which are newly being built. And informal land transactions are also happening. But yeah, in Indian scenario, we have not really come across very obvious examples of informal land transactions, but definitely there's a lot of private sort of land transaction that happens, because there are private entrepreneurs as well as government, which is sort of taking over some of these lands. They are acquiring lands for large enclaves. So, but yeah, informal land transaction is an important part, because such informal land transactions have been seen in peri-urban areas of Africa. So there a lot of informal land transaction has taken place. But at the same time, we have to see that, you know, as UN Habitat report has also said that, you know, this is a very growing area, and over a period of time we'll see that 85% of the development process is going to happen in the peri-urban. So we cannot sort of negate, or we cannot afford to not give importance to this. Yeah, so now I come to my main sort of presentation, where, yeah, I mean, I am referring to Andhra Pradesh because this study was done before the state formation, the Telangana state formed. So in that context, so basically this is the Rangareddy district. You see the white portion over there. This white section is the Hyderabad district, which is completely urban in nature, and outside is the sort of, this is the district which is sort of just outside the Hyderabad district, and it comprises both urban and rural. And basically most of the peri-urban areas are, this red line is basically the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, and most of the peri-urban areas are actually around this red line. Yeah, so so just to sort of give an idea of how population has been increasing. So basically Hyderabad district has been registering a rather sort of a declining population growth, while Rangareddy had been growing at a very, very fast rate. So this is primarily the reason why peri-urbanization has been happening in around Hyderabad city. So yeah, so this is a more closer look. So this outside boundary is basically the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority, which is very newly formed entity. It kind of came up in 2005 with the merging of 3 development authorities which existed in Hyderabad before that. So it kind of, those three entities was the Cyberabad Development Authority, the Hyderabad Airport Development Authority, the new airport which has come up in sort of in this area in Shamshabad, and there was another Buddha Purnima authority. All these 3 merged into the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority, but it sort of actually it encompasses also the rural areas. But the thing is that it is called the Metropolitan Development Authority, but it's mostly looking at developing or acquiring land for large SEZs and IT parks. But it's not and of course developing the other infrastructure like roads and electricity lines and things like that, and providing water for those specific IT parks and enclaves for which they are acquiring land, and not to the rural areas as such. So this is a kind of, this map basically shows the 4 villages which have been studied, the 4 peri-urban villages. One is this Aliabad here, one is Mallampet, one is Pirancheru, and one is Ravirala. And you see all of them are actually outside the boundaries of the Greater Hyderabad Metropolitan Corporation, and it is between the metropolitan boundary and the Hyderabad Development Authority boundary. And this red thick line is the outer ring road, which has recently come up. Yeah. And to kind of give you an idea how the growth corridors have come up in around the city, is that this is the main area where most of the growth happened in Hyderabad after the IT revolution. So this is the major chunk. So, and this has actually happened in the peri-urban areas. So when we are talking about most of the development is now happening, going to happen in the peri-urban areas, this is where sort of it comes in, you know, this whole aspect. And the next area which developed is the Shamshabad area here, and it kind of, this was actually connected because the ring road started developing from here and it moved towards the airport. So naturally this whole area became more important. And of course some smaller areas have also come up in these sections, the northeast and the eastern section. Yeah, so this is just sort of giving an idea how these IT parks have kind of clustered around this area. So it kind of, this map is kind of close to the previous map that I showed, where you do see a lot of sort of growth happening towards the northwest. So the larger chunk is here, yeah. Okay, yeah, so this is also basically another map which is sort of highlighting on those 4 villages over here. Yeah, okay, thank you. Now I quickly moving on to the water dynamics. So I already gave you a brief idea of what water dynamics is all about. So if you look at this, those 4 villages, you see the 3 main areas which are kind of merging into each other, and they are like the main stakeholders, you know, for the water that exists there, that is agriculture, industry, and domestic. And if you look at the second table on the right, you will see that, you know, domestic can be actually divided into 2, where the users are the residents and the uses are the basic uses. While you look at the other domestic, which is basically the gated enclaves, which are using water from the tankers. They're using water users are the tankers for the domestic, as well as the direct users, which are swimming pools and gardens and fountains, etc. And industry, of course, needs it as an input. And agriculture and fishing are the other two traditional activities which continue to be there in some of these areas, not in all. And this is the basic way in which water has been provided to the villages, to the peri-urban villages. And it is basically from the Rural Water Supply Department, which provides water through the panchayat bore wells, and directly then through the overhead storage tank or the ground level storage tank, it is delivered to the houses. And we did see that, these 4 villages, like the Pirancheru had highest number of, households being covered by the panchayat supply system, and overall about 72%, but basically the infrastructure is very poor. It's a very old structure. The pipelines have not been changed. So basically, there is a big difference between the infrastructure of these villages vis-a-vis the enclaves which are coming up in the vicinity. So if we look at the infrastructure, then you see that the situation where, if we consider that this area is a growing area and it's going to be included within the city in coming years, then we would expect a better infrastructure. So in that sense, the situation is pretty bad because, there are 160 households that are depending on a stand post in Ravirala. In Aliabad, only the situation was slightly better and meets the World Bank norms. Apart from that, Pirancheru also it was 83 and Mallampet it was 121. So basically, if we compare this to the scenario in the, it will come up in the slides, in the next slides, I'll show you. But basically, the problem, the insecurity that is slowly coming up is one in the context of the quantity of water that is available and also the quality. Basically, most of these villages are facing problems because of quality issues, and they were depending on groundwater, on bottled water, 63%, and they were also depending on bottled water for cooking in certain situations. This is another very, very difficult scenario in a peri-urban area. Although it is growing, there is no concern for the kind of quality of water that is being received by the residents. And the deterioration was happening because of these enclaves. So you see effluents being untreated effluents from the industries in Mallampet, groundwater being polluted in Pirancheru because of hospital waste, and contamination from sewer lines, as well as fluoride contamination in Aliabad and Ravirala. So these were some of the problems. And the other problem is that Panchayat doesn't have another source, while gated enclaves have another source. So that is where the problem also comes up. So basically what people are doing is the coping mechanisms are to travel to longer distances to other stand posts, and depending on tankers, as I said, they also depend on tankers, they depend on their neighbors for water. While this is the scenario in the development enclaves. So you see people have a infrastructure whereby they can access up to 567 LPCD of water every day. They have huge storage tanks, and they have bore wells, several bore wells. If they require, they can also access water through tankers. They do not have the problem of affordability which the residents in the peri-urban areas are facing. And so inequities I've already mentioned is terms of infrastructure, and also in certain cases special pipelines that are being given by the water board through the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority to these gated enclaves and not to the village residents. So impact, literature says that, acquisition of land and water grabbing, gated enclaves, as I've already spoken, gated enclaves are just 2 minutes. Yeah, and so I already mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, and research locations are actually pointing to the same. So you do see a commercial and residential development which is affecting groundwater, fishing is affected, unplanned development, the water bodies, surface water bodies in the areas are getting are drying up, and that is affecting agriculture as well as other activities. And water selling is becoming a very important aspect. So these are some of the very basic impacts on agriculture. I'll just skip. Fishermen have been facing problems in Mallampet because illegally the water body was cordoned off, so that kind of cut them off from the water source. So, and then with the outer ring road being constructed, further there was sort of shrinking of the water body, so they lost their source of income. Washer folk in Ravirala have faced a similar kind of scenario where they have also lost access to the surface water body which was present in Ravirala village, and that has sort of led to from 100 households almost only 30 households are now pursuing this particular livelihood. And so basically it is, we have to understand that nobody wants to own this peri-urban area. It doesn't belong to HMDA, it doesn't want to take responsibility. Panchayat has a very limited role. Water board doesn't supply water to these villages because they are only operating within the municipal boundaries. So, but at the same time, whoever feels that it is a convenient space, they want to enter that space and they want to grab the water, they want to sort of provide water for their own means, and there is no accountability, and nobody wants to take responsibility at the end of the day. So basically one has to look at is identifying the peri-urban areas, because their critical state of resources need to be mapped. The water bodies need special identification, which is missing currently. And then the AP Volta Act needs to be sort of entwined with the state water policy. That is very important, because if that doesn't happen, it will be difficult to bring this into a kind of a better situation. And strict monitoring of agricultural wells which are now selling water. So once that is done, perhaps we could sort of protect some of the water bodies. And then improving the infrastructure of the village. Somebody has to take the responsibility of improving the water situation of the villages as well. I mean, while you're developing the gated enclaves, you should also take care of the villages. So that is something. So, but it has to be centrally decided that who is going to be the main person monitoring and who are going to be the people who will follow the rules and the regulations that are sort of designed accordingly. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just to give you a brief background about myself, I'm Anamika. I'm doing my PhD right now in KU Leuven, Belgium. And the presentation I'm going to do today is just part of my PhD. And what I'm going to do is to illustrate the interstitial spaces in case of Gurugram city, Gurgaon as we know it, and try to see the spatial and social transformation that are happening in these interstitial spaces. I hope that I can bring in some kind of an action to what was presented right now. We always see these urban villages as being poor and kind of facing all the difficulty side, but this is kind of a very different story, a different outlook towards it. So let's see what's happening in case of Gurgaon. But before that, I will just situate you all in the Gurgaon context. So if you look into the story of Gurgaon, at around till 1970s, 90s, 1980s, Gurgaon was just mere a suburb. We all know that. But it was around 1990s when Indian economy was liberalized to global economy, and there were particular urban reforms that were introduced, which have already been spoken about in earlier panels, like liberalization, privatization, and political devolution. It was during this time that a private developer called KP Singh, along with his company DLF, kind of walked in Gurgaon. There were many push factors from Delhi and many pull factors, I would say, from Haryana that kind of made KP Singh to choose Gurgaon, that we can discuss later. But as soon as he kind of he stepped in Gurgaon, the whole story of Gurgaon from being a mere suburb completely took a radical U-turn, and now it became the new urban frontier of globalizing India or neoliberal India. It became the pace leader. So, but what you see is if the story of Gurgaon in the year of millennium was kind of reciting its, a glorious story, it was in the years of later millennium that the story of Gurgaon started to fall apart. Now, this was mainly because Gurgaon faced severe infrastructure dysfunction and failure. There was no public transportation basic facilities like roads or public transportation, power, or even water for that matter. And now Gurgaon was started to seen as a model of failure and was much in a discussion of how not to build a city. Now, as KP Singh would kind of argue that when this private-public partnership was established, the services, the private developers basically were supposed to take care of the entity of their islands, and what was happening beyond the privatized city was supposed to be taken care by the state. So he argues that the private developers kind of went really fast, but what we see that our state was kind of left way behind in order to, get to this fast development. Now, what happens when our state is, like even in earlier panels, we discussed that if we have a weak state or there is no state, what happens? Does the city kind of, ends there? I don't think so, because that never happened in Gurgaon. So private developers kind of take center stage. So if there was no power, they bring in generators to provide power. I mean, it's like 75% of the power is provided by the diesel generators. And if there were no water in Gurgaon, okay, they start to drill private bore wells. You'll be amazed to know that till 1980s, till Gurgaon was still a suburb, the water level was just 6 meters below. But it was in last year, in 2016, that a report suggested that this water level has reached to dark zone. It's around 28 meters below. And in few societies of DLF development, the water has touched to 45 to 50 meters below. So you can imagine the scale of this private borewell kind of development. So if there was no public transportation, this is the first rapid metro which has come up by DLF themselves, and a 15 kilometer corridor, transport corridor is coming up by DLF. We know that kind of DLF has 4 times the police security, as compared to the whole of Gurgaon. So what I'm trying to say is that when something like that happened, there were many urban researchers like me maybe who got really interested to know what was the reason behind Gurgaon's disintegrating condition. And a few scholars suggested that maybe this is because of the weak state or absence of state. There were few scholars who suggested that it is not because of the flawed planning or absence of state, but it was because Gurgaon manifests a different sort of planning. Like, for example, Guru Rani suggests that it is because of the practice of flexible planning that accommodates the desires and demands of wealthy and political elites. Now, giving a different perspective, like Rohan Kalyan, he suggests that he's trying to give a post-colonial perspective, and he tries to say that he reads this neoliberal architecture as national post-colonial identity. And a similar note by Anthony D. King, he tries to say that even in today's neoliberal and global world, the asymmetrical power relations are being continuously reinvented in an internal kind of in a form. So what I'm trying to say is that we see the fragmented Gurgaon now from kind of 2 perspectives. I wish I could say a dominant perspective, but I'm not going to I don't want people to target me with post-colonial perspective and all. But then the most 2 prominent kind of theoretical perspective we see is on neoliberal urbanism and post-colonial identity. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to read these spaces as either receptor of certain urban processes or spaces of instrument that, like if you talk about control, gated communities and which are to exclude or to control. So we usually conceive these spaces as receptor or instrument. Now, it was not all these obviously these theoretical perspectives were very much interested I mean, I was really fascinated by these theories. But what was most like kind of my position was that I had lived in Gurgaon for 3 years. So while I was living in a village, I was working in a US-based firm, the Ecom, and I was working on DLF's master plan. So I've been in this kind of a dialectic where I've been living in a ruler or a periphery, I could say, and working in the center. And what I have experienced was a bit different to what these theoretical reflections were kind of narrating the story of Gurgaon. That is where I started my journey of doing my research in Gurgaon. And today, the focus of my research, it's a bit different to what the other investigations are. For example, the first, I guess, the difference is that I'm looking at the interstitial spaces. So I would say that in today's neoliberal urbanism, we fancy two things. We fancy either the mega projects, the big privatized city, and we kind of criticize it, or we look at into the opposite, the slums, and we talk about those slums. And I feel that these two drastic kind of, if you look into these two drastic forms of neoliberal urbanism, you often tend to forget what is in between. And I feel it is this in between, sometimes the ordinary spaces that sometimes are more, if you read them, you will get to know more out what's happening. So I will not talk a lot about methodology, but it is based on empirical grounded research. But I'm not trying to follow the deductive reasoning. Rather, I'm more focused into abductive reasoning, because I truly believe that theory stands like it's really important for us to combine with the empirical grounded research. And one more big difference in my study is that I don't conceive these spaces as a receptor or instrument to focus is in this research. This concept is also elaborated by Edward. Okay, so I just moved. These are the theories, so we can discuss about my case study. This is where I lived while I worked in DLF Cyber City, and there were three kind of different spatial configuration that I kind of identified in this village. One was the old village, the core of it. The other one was the EW quarters where I lived, and then there were some slums. Now, when you go to these old villages and you try to read the spatial transformation that has happened, you will see either the old village fabric is kind of replaced by something really new forms of spatial dimension. Like for example, this one. This is the new villa. I mean, it looks very luxurious. It's the new villa that is coming up in these old fabric of village, and you will wonder what are these. So from there, I start to decode in understanding what actually happened, and then you realize that these villas, this is where the old villagers now live. So they are no more poor, okay, they are rich, but it's understandable that they are rich. But how do you understand if they're like super rich? What happened? So you get into the story and you realize that when KP Singh, so this site is also very important, because not only because I lived here, of course, but this was the very first village that KP Singh kind of came and it started acquiring his land. So I would say that this village has kind of the palimpsest of the last 2 decades that Gurgaon has seen the transformation of. So when KP Singh started acquiring his land, it was not on normal ground that he said that I'm going to give you money and you give me a land, you would take a lot of money from me and just give the land. What he did was he kind of formed a network with these villages, also because of his presence, because I mean they are Yadav and he himself is Jat, so you belong to a same social structure, you start to connect, you start to bargain, you start to kind of negotiate. And what he did was that he convinced these villages in a group. Okay, we are not talking about 1 or 2 villages, but in a group, he convinced these villages to invest back in DLF company. So what happened was, KP Singh in his autobiography, he writes that there were days that he used to give money to the villages for their fields, and by night they used to come back saying that I want to invest back in DLF development of the city. So, I mean, you can imagine, DLF is now the third, it ranks third in the real estate market. KP Singh has moved to 8th richest person in the world, according to Forbes. So you can imagine this urban villages have now definitely become the millionaires of Gurgaon. So now they are not only they have not only economically grown, but they are very influential. I mean, they are politically very influential because that's the village. I mean, that's Gurgaon it belongs to them. So they are the Yadavs, they are the Jats, so they are politically very kind of influential, and now they are super rich. So of course, I mean, they have grown, but then now, things are changing. So for the future, I mean, they change their occupation. Of course, agriculture is no more their occupation. So what do they do? Now they become property dealers themselves. They become property developers. Many of them have malls in Gurgaon, and the clubs, the pub, the bars that you see, these are the new lifestyles that they're trying to kind of create. One of, like, for example, the second side of the spatial, so I argue that this Professor Chatterjee, who tries to say that this is kind of an invisible network between the private developers and Nathapur villages that is based on personalized exchange and profitability. So in this image, you see that they are kind of not happy about it, but I would argue that this never happened in Nathapur village. Maybe they were eager to, feed KP Singh with a slice of cake. So what you see is that if you come in the EWS housing where I was staying, so my owner of where I was living in the apartment, my owner himself, he was the villager. Now this was a EWS housing which was first meant to, of course, provide the lower income group. And this was, again, a collaboration. So DLF was supposed to give at least 15% of the EWS housing. But he kind of collaborated with the villagers. He said, you do the EWS housing, and you'll be able to rent out, and you'll be able to earn from it. So the villagers, of course, they were very happy. And you will see that one villager will have one lane of, it's the whole street belongs to, I just take one more minute. So one whole street is a village's, it's his domain. So he divided his site and he has built these EWS housing. So they're kind of really, really present there. They are transforming the villages. You will also see in the slums. So if you feel that, okay, there are this, now, okay, of course, EWS quarters is not for them, they have to move. And you see that these slum dwellers, usually they come and they occupy their own space. That's why we see them near railway lines or wherever spaces they get. But it's not the case in Gurgaon. These spaces are provided by urban villages. They are kind of divided, and they are provided with, services. For example, I mean, we can be critical in looking at private developers and say, on one hand, they are kind of digging bore well and they are providing diesel generators because of the situation. But you come into the urban village, the scenario is same. So if you go into the slums, there is one house in the slum at the end where you go and open the door, and there is a diesel generator. There is a bore well. So, it's kind of a system that I have started to read here that I see that these urban villages themselves are becoming very important stakeholders in production of spaces. I guess I can end right here. I mean, these were some of the reflections that I wanted to give. But mainly, I would like to end with Professor Edgar Pierce's suggestion that he tries to say that it's important to look that there are not only top-down not only the neo-corporate stakeholders in neoliberal urbanism in the production of spaces, but there is also what is happening a lot at the bottom-up approach. Like in case of Gurgaon, you see that if you try to understand it with power cube, that there are different forms of power, and I kind of locate myself here. So I see these, I see this invisible connection that these urban villages are usually invisible, that we never tend to study from their perspective, and they're equally creating the space. So this is where I would like to end. Thank you.
I think Anamika sort of introduced Gurgaon for me, and I'm sort of one of those people that Sudeshna was talking. I talk about the positionality of the peripheral, of the peri-urban. So my topic is the honor economy in the land market of peri-urban Budheda. Budheda is a village. I'll show you the location. So what I'm looking at is the socio-cultural factors that sort of distort this rational optimization framework in land markets. So here's the three theorisations which state that, here are the three forms in which culture and social factors come into play. The first is economic literature on status signaling. So this is something where, your priorities are skewed in terms of signaling your status. This is a very universal thing. So in the US, you see that suburban communities, they have this sort of single family restriction. You have to have single family with a minimum lot size and all this. And that is sort of a status signal that drives urban planners like you guys crazy. Then there is exchange and social distance. So exchange is like, this is something that anthropologists have talked about. So for example, if I'm selling my land to a friend or to a stranger, my prices would be different. There is a social domain of interaction in a land market. The third, which is my domain, is regimes of value and Bourdieu's, Pierre Bourdieu's symbolic capital. So I state, according to Appadurai's social life of things, I state that objects circulate in different regimes of value, and through which desire, demand, reciprocal sacrifice, and power interact to create economic value. So it's basically Appadurai states that, a commodity, if you look at the social life of a commodity, it's not really the thing in itself. It is the social relation to the thing. Like for example, land. Land, for most of its time, it does not exist as a commodity. I mean, for most of the social life of land, it was not a commodity. It is just, urbanization come, and then you perceive of land as a commodity, and then all these social relations you have with it come into play, and then you start from Appadurai's following the social value of things, and then you move to Bourdieu, and he says that you should extend economic calculation beyond just currency, you should extend economic calculation to the symbolic goods as well, which is like a handshake, honor, friendship, patronage. So you should extend economic calculation to embrace all this. Now, one distinction, Bourdieu does not state that economics is meaningless. Bourdieu states that it is similar self-interest at work here, just a different, more more inclusive framework where you are looking at different types of currencies. But there is a quid pro quo. So here's where I find my provocation. Price of Land, Sanjay Chakravarti, about India. He says that if many landowners refuse to sell, if some are willing to die, there must be something seriously wrong with the price of land acquisition. So he says, this is the reservation price, this is the price at which farmers are willing to sell. So, if there is land acquisition problems, there must be something wrong with the price. And he gives some token value to like symbolism and status and honor factors, but he does not it's mostly like all economic work. So I relate to my fieldwork from Budhera. So Budhera has 4 basic factors. High land prices, the circle rates is 1 crore per acre because it's just 4 kilometers from the periphery of Gurgaon. There is acute acquisition. I'll show you a map. So here's Gurgaon. Budhera, as you see, is not far away. If you see this place, this is the water treatment plant, Chandu Budhera. This is the Najafgarh drain. This black path I've stated is the canals, 3 canals that transport water to the Gurgaon water treatment plant. And this place, and this place, there is almost like 1/3 of agricultural land in Budhera has been acquired or sort of damaged, submerged. These canals leak, this water treatment plant inundates the land around it because of seepage. So, there is massive acute acquisition in Budhera. And there is an inactive land market since 2010. There is not much land sales going on. There was a very active land market. And what I want to highlight is the micro land market with distinct logics. So, okay, this is basically me trying to do in 2 photos what a good photographer with a DSLR can do in 1 photo. This is the Dwarka-Gurgaon Expressway. You can see that it is coming up. It is, you can see these new buildings coming up. And this is the photo I've taken from Budhera. Where I talk about the distinct logics of Budhera's land market. So the identity of Zamidar. This is my punchline. Subedar, Chaukidar, Thanedar, Tahsildar, sab daro se behtar Zamidar. I give the English translation. So you see, Budhera is in Haryana, and Haryana is a Jat area. Now, if you look at the history of Jats, it's a small historical thing. Jats were part of the 1857 rebellion against the Britishers. So in that time, the Britishers, at that time, Jats were like landless tenants. They did not have land. So the Britishers tried to sort of mollify them by giving them some land rights, making these canals, investing in agriculture. And at that time, between 1857 to 1900, the Jats were actually involved in this sort of fight where they would murder people, they would arson, they would bribe patwaris to change land records. Britishers would sometimes carry out this sale of estates. So what the Jats would do, they would pull in their capital together and they would buy that estate from the British and they would send a small colony of their Jat brothers to go and settle there. So that is how Jats sort of became landowners. And after 1950 India, they became they got this Bhumidhari settlement where they sort of got land. So the Jats actually have this sense of pride that, we became landowners by our own rights. So they don't call themselves Krishak or Kisan, they call themselves Jamidar. And this thing, it also applies to Gurgaon. So in Budhera, even though they are Yadavs, they call themselves Jamidar. They don't, any person who owns land is a Jamidar. Now, what it means for peri-urbanization, the land market is that, I don't want to lose the title of Jamidar. So if I have 4 acres and my title of Jamidar depends on the idea that I have land in the village, I will only sell 3 acres at most. I will not sell that last acre. I don't care what price you give me. And that creates a problem because you need land parcels. There was an SEZ coming up and all it got was fragmented land. Because people are not willing to let go of that last parcel of land, which gives them that title. So that is one major sort of nuance in Budhera's land market. The other nuance is association with person's integrity. So the shame attached to land sales, beti aur zameen nahi bechna chahiye. This is sort of a gendered understanding of land where you're talking of Jameen as like my daughter, but also my daughter as my property, like a Jameen. So in that sense, here's a very peculiar characteristic. So when you have the Beti, so in Gurgaon, if you sell your land, it's associated with shame. In the older days, they used to talk about their grandfathers. When they sold their land, they would sell it secretly. And they would have a agreement with the buyer, who was often an outsider, that, you know, you let me go into the land and I'll plant these fake seeds so that people don't know that I sold the land. And you are only allowed to sell your land in two circumstances. One is you are in dire circumstance, like economic hardship. Two is for your daughter's marriage or something like that. But if you sell it for greed, if you are perceived to sell it as for greed, that's a problem. Now what happens? There are people I saw, for example, there's a person who has a land of 1 acre. The circle rate for it is 1 crore. The market rate for it is 1.5 crore, because the market rate is usually ahead of the circle rate. But they are not willing to sell it to the market, even though that's a 50 lakh premium. But they're very happy for their compensation, for the government to acquire their land, because Sarkar is my bap. There is no honor or shame attached to it if Sarkar acquires a land. Yeah. So in that sense, that's how it works. And this has implications for the state-society relations. The third is the gendered understanding of land. Daughter as property, as I told you. The other is this very interesting, so I told you two factors that are basically impeding land purchases. One is that they don't want to let go of land. The second is that there is a shame attached to sell land for greed. Now, that means land is not available for sale. And there is a whole lot of brokers who have opened their offices and they are dependent on land transactions happening. So what did they do? In Haryana in 2010, they changed the inheritance laws so that, you know, daughters and sons get equal share. That was not earlier. So what happens now is that, but what happens in practice is that when the father dies, the daughter and son get the equal share. The daughter, for a token payment, gives the land to his brother for a lease of 99 years or something, for like nothing. And you know, that is how the patriarchal structure is maintained. The brokers, they are sort of intervening there. They are instigating the daughters and their families, you know, reclaim your land, you know, and you know, I'll give you a good price for it. So these kind of dynamics are happening. So brokers are like a very, sort of the housebreakers, bad reputation people. So, and then the differential enforcement and expectations of honor along lines of gender and caste. So for example, I met this woman who is a widow. She has a land of like 1/4 acre. She is a widow. She is working on sometimes brick work, and her son is a person in a mall with like 7,000 salary. She really needs the money. She really wants to sell her land, but she is a widow. So these kind of social norms are much heavier for a woman to negotiate. You know, if she said that if I had a man, then I could probably sell my land and I could bear all that shame and all that rumors and all that stuff that came with it. But I am a widow, so I can't, and my son is not really in a position of power yet. And then again, it goes along caste. So this is my idea of the honor economy of studying like micro land markets. In Jennifer Baca, when she talks about rural Tamil Nadu, he says that if a farmer decides to sell land, he typically did not discuss it with others, as selling land is considered shameful. This secrecy may have facilitated the land acquisition process because the land brokers would likely have been aware of this cultural practice. So you can see that in one sense, the shame of selling land in Gurgaon, it blocks land acquisition, but in Jennifer Baca's study in Tamil Nadu, it facilitates land acquisition. And this is also like another thing, that agrarian distress and farmer suicide. So farmers are willing to commit suicide rather than selling land. So these are like other sort of references to the honor economy of land in other literature. So my last point is that honor is strategically deployed. It's not that honor does not operate along lines and axes of power. So for example, honor is a central form of capital, then much of social practice must be interpreted in terms of producing and consuming, hoarding or expending honor. So like in this place, how do you hoard honor? You donate to a Goshala, or you do all these kind of cultural practices. I won't go into that, but there is a currency of honor that operates in this village. And the last point is the tropes of ruralness and urbanness are used by the villagers in idealized conceptions of spatial orders, which social actors simultaneously internalize and play off by practices, strategies, and socially embedded negotiation in a space where the rural-urban binary is quite blurred. So I'm saying that, the sort of greed and the selling of land for money is associated with the urbanness, and your honor and your large and everything is associated with ruralness. And this is something actually, this is a different area of my topic where I talk about negotiations along water. And I see that in the negotiations along water, often they sort of describe themselves as urban when it suits their interest. They say that, everyone is self-servicing, self-interested nowadays. So we are almost urban. You can see this building over there. But then when they have to exert power, they describe their ruralness. We are like, we are descendants of, we are not these kind of, it's a very gendered understanding. So I say that it's a very strategic deployment of honor, and there is a political ecology, there's a power connection to it. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting set of papers. I have a bunch of questions that I would like to ask, but I will hold on that and just sort of open it up. Questions?
Hi, this is not so much a question, rather a comment, particularly to Anamika's paper. I lived in Gurgaon between 94 and 99. I studied at Shushan School of Art and Architecture when it was mostly a sleeper colony for Connaught Place. And it goes back to almost the 60s. I think that was some of the initial developments that happened. Then, of course, Maruti built their factory not too far away. So there are a lot of various factors that led to most of what people know today about Gurgaon is this IT city. But I would argue, and Gurgaon, Delhi is, it's good to juxtapose Bangalore with that. I mean, they come from two extremes. So I think there's a huge role to play for the automobile and the automobile industry, even now. Very similar to what happened in America, where the automobile industry, for example, in LA, dismantled.
Presentations, since also, yes, I also am negotiate Gurgaon. So I was wondering whether, as related to the first presentation, whether it is possible, if you look at the situation of the urban villages, most of the janitors, maids, cooks, drivers, all these kinds of, let's say, infrastructure, which these big offices actually mostly come from urban villages. So I've always wondered whether that map of urban villages that you showed, it's not a question of things transforming the urban village, but the urban village itself, the cyber city is a plug into Nathapur, in the sense that, like electricity, if you didn't have the janitors and security guard from Nathapur, that would not work. And so I was wondering whether you could comment on that. And secondly, to the very interesting study about symbolic capital and that, I was wondering, in this situation, which is a very common situation in these villages, where the house, if they own a house, let's say in the village, that you move out and you make it into a rental sort of accommodation. You build up your house, you divide it into 8 rooms, into 3 floors, and you suddenly become a landlord of a different sort, and you rent it to maids and security guards. Is there, and there's a politics of that, of who you rent it to. So 2 questions.
Maybe we can take a few more and just collect the questions, and after about 3 or 4 we can just sort of go. So Gautam also had his hand up, and
Thanks for those. Just a provocation for the panel in a sense. I think that one of Karen opened in terms of thinking provocatively about the periphery as a conceptual space, not a object. And I'm wondering if it's worth butting heads a little bit between the periphery and the peri-urban. And whether you think you can push those two concepts together in some sense, right? Because I think the one thing about the peri-urban is that the way of thinking about it as this kind of middle spatial location between the rural and the urban is something that doesn't actually give us much anymore. Because that sort of implies that there's a kind of transition narrative. It's either temporal or it's spatial. You're headed one way. Right? The thing about most peri-urban areas of metropolitan regions is that they're really quite stable end states. And so I think that in the way we challenge the idea of the informal not as a transition from developing to developed economies, right? In economics, we did this fight about modernization, etc. What's the counter fight here? I mean, I'm still wondering if it's not about the physical peripherality, then what is peri-urban giving us in terms of urbanism dynamics? I know what it gives us in terms of governmental jurisdiction, so fine. But what work is this concept doing for us? Because I'm not quite clear that if you did all the work on Gurgaon and never use the very word peri-urban, would anything about our arguments change? And I actually feel that they won't. And so then I'm wondering and saying, what is this category doing for us? And can we mobilize a much more flexible, light notion of the periphery as something that marks power relations in some way and is less geographical? So that's the provocation that I wanted to give a little bit in thinking about.
So, yeah, I wanted to second a great panel, a lot of fantastic presentations. My question is focused more on Karen's paper, a really interesting paper, and there was so much richness there that we didn't get a chance to maybe talk about each thing, so maybe I'm basically asking you to say a bit more about things that you touched on. So two of them are, I was very curious. I loved this looking and disclosing different types of urbanisms, which I think gets to what Gautam is saying too about how we disclose these urbanisms. And but because you're doing water's edge, I was really curious how you're making the case that thinking sort of in terms of the environment adds an extra dimension to revealing these types of urbanisms, not just because the water is all these settlements are situated in the water, but the actual agency also of the water was involved. And you sort of talked about the logics over time of when it was sort of a space that was desired and then it became sort of a sore spot and something that had to be an obstacle. So I'm wondering really my first question is really what are the different types of agencies and politics that the water's edge might disclose to us? And is it enabling, for example, auto construction because that space was open for it and then it became disabling because of obstacles? How might we think about it? And then the second question, you had mentioned and touched on this idea of entrenchment versus worlding. And I was curious if you see that as a tension. It actually ties to, I think, also Anamika's point about this interstitial kind of spaces. And I'm wondering if you're also disclosing something about that tension, because you mentioned sort of world-class aspirations as playing a role, but you also mentioned that there are many sort of ground-up processes that, worlding might not really capture. So I wanted to kind of hear more about those two, but thanks very much.
So maybe we can do a round of responses, one, and then come back and take another 3 or 4 questions. Is that
The first question that you wanted to kind of know about the urban village and the service sector. So yes, it's true that urban villages are kind of, they're positioned in a way that they are now, they accommodate the service class or the middle class that kind of is completely related to the IT sector, which, the service, so they kind of provide the service to what the sector is right next to it. But in case of Natupur, what's the thing is that urban villages are mainly kind of actors, they are very important stakeholders who are spatially transforming these spaces, and they have a higher position in providing services. Like they are not the one who are working like security guards or auto rickshaw drivers. No, their position is that they are the property brokers or dealers. So they are at a very higher position. They own bar in a mall in Gurgaon. So the service sector that you're looking is mainly the migrants who come, mostly from West Bengal, and there's this conflict. So what I was trying to show in this presentation was only show a part of the agencies that has resulted to this, but there are many ways, new agencies that are giving new forms to contestation, and one among this is that private the villages are now accommodating Bangladesh, and it's controversial, but then that's leading to new forms of contestation. So the service class mainly, they are located in Natupur village, but not in a village, not in an overall village, because there is also middle class like I was working in a US-based firm, so I was earning enough, but I could not be accommodated in the privatized city because of the expenses for many more reasons, and I was the one who was living in EWS housing in Natupur village. So it's a mixed society where there exists the service class also. Coming to Gautam's question, where what I was trying to do with this presentation was that it is also related to your panel, which was towards practice and theory. Now, what I understood that I will kind of confess that when I was in KU Leuven, I did my master thesis in Gurgaon. And that time I was in a department which was theory of urbanization. So I was very much into theories of modernization and post-colonialism. My professor, my guide herself, Hilde Heyn, she is one of the very known personality in theory of urbanism. And what happened that when there was this perception, there was this bubble which was created around me that what is happening in Gurgaon could be because of these kind of new neoliberal perspective that we have. It is because of private developers' monopolies. It's because we have this post-colonial national imaginary that I was little influenced. And when I took this site, but then there was always in my mind that what I'm trying to read is way different to what I've experienced while I was living in Gurgaon, because I knew I have somehow experienced these urban villages to be, dominant, and they are not kind of the one who are fighting to claim spaces. They are dominant and they are claiming spaces in a bigger way. So in that master thesis, when I went to Gurgaon and I went back to Natupur village, the whole 6 months of study, I faced a lot of difficulty going back in my department and convincing them that I started with this perspective, but I don't want to end it that way, because what I see on site is completely different. And it took me time to convince my professors that there's a different way to look into this site. I mean, I guess there are many theories. I mean, from last 5 or 6 years, I've been reading so much that Susan Parnell, she's trying to say that we need to provincialize our understanding of these transformation. There's Theodore who's trying to say that we need to rethink, retheorize what is happening in Global South. And I see that this is where I stand, that with my experience, even being an architect, even being a designer, a landscape designer, living in Gurgaon, I kind of got influenced with what everyone is saying. But then when you go to the site and you see this, you come out with a different perspective altogether. And that was kind of new beginning to my PhD. And what I'm trying to do here is study it. I mean, the thing is that I'm re-theorizing it. I looked into it and I was not convinced, so I'm going back to my site and looking afresh into what is happening in Gurgaon with a new lens. And still, this is not based on what, I don't want to say that this is based on the new theories that you have to be context sensitive now, but it is due to my understanding of what's happening in Natupur village. It's due to the empirical research that I'm doing, that from there I want to grow beyond. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'll answer your question first. Yeah, there is a rental economy that's very prevalent in the peri-urban, exactly in the way you mentioned. I don't know the sort of the symbolism and the politics of how people access, is there a xenophobia, is there a social networks through which migrants choose to live here or are allowed to live there? But I can tell you about what happens as a consequence of this, this rental economy. It's that the peri-urban has become a space where there are multiple different categories. There are farmhouse owners, there are peri-urban original residents, there are migrant laborers, there are middle-class commuters. They all have different interests and perceptions. So, it's a space where social forms are being created and discarded daily. So, and that foments a lot of conflict and resolution. So, my study has been more on the consequences of this sort of rental economy or this sort of diverse, heterogeneous peri-urban. But I don't know about the, where it comes from, like what are the politics, how to access that peri-urban. Next, Gautam asked about, like, he gave a panel sort of question. I'll give you a new definition that I'm sort of maybe thinking about in terms of a very local context. The peri-urban is the place where is the place which is saturated with the metabolism of the city. It is not a place where the materiality of the city has arrived. Budhera, the buildings, what you associate the cities with, the towers, the malls, that's seeping in very slowly. But one trend I have noticed around Gurgaon is the metabolic infrastructure of the city, the sewage treatment plant, the water treatment plant, the canals, they're all in the peripheries. And I am sort of interested to explore this peri-urban as a place which is actually you can almost define it as a place that is servicing that is the ecological hinterland of the city, that's the local ecological hinterland of the city. It is saturated by all this urban metabolic infrastructure, not serviced by them. The flows go to the city, and that is sort of, maybe, it doesn't answer your question, but that's a sort of a new localized definition of the peri-urban I'm exploring.
Yeah, great. That helped me a little bit because, yeah, I want to sort of push back against your pushback, Gautam, a little bit and try and answer both Yafa and you together. Because I think that the peripheral and the peri-urban come together in that I think you can't get away from the geography of the peripheral. While it's also sort of a principle, a mode, and all of that, it is very much located in certain kinds of territories and territorial relations and a very sort of a geographic concept. So I want to kind of put that back in, and so I think when you're talking about the periphery as a mode of the ongoing production of space, then you have what I've been trying to point out in my sort of arc that I'm pointing out is that you have certain areas that are backyards at one point in terms of a certain value, a certain way that they are not regarded, and then when value gets created there through processes of auto construction, etc., you get a displacement into other kinds of peripheries, which are often geographical. They go out into peri-urban areas or along other sort of invisible kinds of landscapes, other backyards. And I think that this sort of process of like this contest between creation, appropriation, destruction, recreation, I think is a kind of a dynamic of the periphery which is very much geographically defined, and therefore I think the peripheral and the peri-urban connect in some of those ways. That's one of the things, and I like, because when you were saying something about, that I think, I was just in the geography of it, I was imagining driving out to these resettlement camps and this bizarre sense of like, the city thins out and you're going out to areas that are somewhat remote despite, the hundreds of IT cars zooming down the same way that these women are going in buses to their homes on the periphery. And I think this helps a lot, is that it's saturated with the metabolism, but the materiality hasn't arrived there. So there's a principle and the geography somehow coming together in these spaces. So that's one thing. I wanted to answer your thing, Yafa. Thank you for allowing me to repeat, go back over some of what I said. I think the water's edge offers a peripheral kind of a landscape because, again, it was a backyard which becomes front yard. And there it becomes a front yard when the aspirations of world classing and a certain sort of a moment of environmentalism or of ecological, eco-restoration, etc., propel these waterways, urban waterways, into the front yards of a world-classing city. So at that time, all of this work that's been done to produce value in terms of urbanisms, of settlement, etc., get devalued, demolished, destroyed, and you move out. So I think the worlding, in one sense, the eco-restoration, etc., are discourses of world classing, but also, and that's what I meant when I said it brings in ecology, because you're having environmental discourses of flood proofing and water conservation, which then plays into turning the periphery into, sort of a zone of appropriation. And so the pushback then from the peripheral urbanists, I'm calling it, is of entrenchment. So while I'm not saying that they're not also worlding in some way, many of these people are working in IT corridor and whatever, that whole thing is there. But the pushback is in terms of staking these claims to these local spaces through histories of routing, building, etc., etc. So I think worlding and entrenching is not really diametrically opposite, but I think signal a different kind of focus of struggle.
Yes, and thank you for this great panel, and I quite liked the discussions, what is emerging out of this discussion, and I think we're all grappling with the terms periphery or peri-urban, and what is kind of crystallizing is also a dimension of temporality. So you spoke about ongoing, and he spoke about saturation. On the other hand, there is geography and there's materiality, and within these dimensions, I also ask myself, when do we actually stop calling something peri-urban? Isn't Gurgaon, for example, urban? When does it become its own form or its own materiality? And I think another sphere of peripheral, what we're talking is also what is peripheral to mind, what we're referencing in the mind, aspirational or to lifestyle, especially what you were speaking as well. So how do we need to separate that? Do we need to bring it to different levels? Do we at some time need to stop to talk about peri-urban? And what are those characteristics in your view?
I had a question actually to Pratik. Interesting presentation, and I really wanted to ask you a little bit more, if you would talk a little bit more about how you understand honor and its trajectory. So for instance, I'm interested in how do you actually see, or do you actually see any changing of this notion of honor? Because I think very much we were looking at how honor sort of affects or impinges on the land economy, and in some sense then relating that to larger processes of urbanization. But if you could also look the other way around and actually tell us, how do you see then honor also as changing, or is it not changing? And that kind of, and really a question for you, Karen. Again, the work is great, and so it's interesting to hear this slice of it from an earlier version. But I wanted to actually, again, ask, sort of thinking a little bit about this idea of entrenching. And what happens, and so what came out very strongly from what you were talking about is this idea of localized territorial sort of nature of the connections, and very much embedding, entrenching in a particular place. And is that, it seemed like from the case studies that people had been there and settled there for a very long time. And it's that I mean, I don't know about long, I don't know, so maybe that, but I think I'm thinking about it in the context of work that I've done in places that are far more sort of, I don't know, transient is not a good word, but let's say that people move in and out, and then you see in particular locations very close to each other at different, operating in different sort of temporalities, especially in terms of built forms. So you have, you know, again, this process as you talked about of creation, appropriation, destruction, recreation. So you have, you know, a one-room tenement, a gala, and then there's rumor, then, oh, we're going to rebuild, then you build it into a chawl, you know, then you move, then you think you have a 3-story building. So there's this constant process, and I think that even the connection between the form and how that's changing, the expectations of how that's changing, and then ultimately, you know, so those changing, those different temporalities, I mean, just sort of thinking about how do you then think of entrenching in, sort of as it relates to this kind of time and it connects to the changing urban form. So maybe not on the Buckingham Canal, but maybe, I don't know, on the edges of the canal or in other spaces that you've looked at. And because the other thing about entrenching, I'm wondering when it doesn't succeed or when it's, let's say, a lot of its efforts are thwarted, then how do you then see that, and do people still continue to want to entrench, or do they actually look at other kinds of relations they might have? Like, just to give a quick example, we had a community, I was studying a Muslim community, they just couldn't actually sort of entrench themselves in for various reasons, and so then they relied increasingly on their Chedabai network, which was largely from their sort of brothers, brothers from their similar villages in Bihar, but not only in Bihar, but also those spread out across the city. So I think that was a very interesting way of how they were trying to entrench, but very much moving outside of their locality and that very rooted place, and using another form of sort of system and network in order. So I don't know if you can comment.
So we'll take a few more questions. I believe you had.
I think in the spirit of questioning all these terms, I would really like to question your use of the word interstitial for the neighborhoods that you describe, because it actually, to my mind, it actually contradicts the historical and the socioeconomic background that you have given, and that I think it's a dangerous term. And I'm looking at this historically again from the perspective of Cairo, where we have villages that are now engulfed within the city and are now described as informal, whereas they were the original settlements. And so I think I would also question your use of that term.
Thank you. My question is actually to Chavi Sharma. You mentioned in your presentation that you had looked at the development of taxi services back in Mumbai, back from the time when they were set up, and you mentioned that there were several transitory phases in between as well. Sorry, when certain changes took place from private cab operators to public service and so on. And I'm wondering if you came across any contestations and debates when you were examining these moments in history, which are kind of similar to the debates that you see right now, because I kind of wonder that whenever these transitions and changes happen, if there is any pattern to the debates that take place, and if there's a pattern to the contestations that take place, and kind of connecting it to the rest of the panel, I wonder if you're looking at the periphery and the peri-urban, and as the urban moves out, are there patterns that you can see across cities and peri-urban spaces across cities which can be pulled out?
Charlotte, and there's one. Okay, so last question after that then, because we're kind of like running into lunchtime as well, so I'm sure everybody wants to also head out. So Charlotte, then.
Thank you for that very interesting set of presentations. My question is to Karen and Chavi. So firstly, I was wondering if you spoke about the history from Meru cabs to all of that. So I was just thinking if you thought about this aspect of how, for the first time, cab drivers are also having this incentive for putting in an extra amount of work, right? And you could just take X number of trips during the peak hours, and then you don't have to work for the rest of the day because you're getting an incentive. And also this, were there people who transition from these older forms of cab networks into these newer forms, right? And did you take account of their stories? And to Karen, again, it's on the similar lines of everyone asks about how you conceptualize as periphery. And I mean, do you see any dangers of characterizing these settlements as an intra-urban periphery? Because both from the story of Wood Wharf that you presented and also from our previous fieldwork in Chennai, I could see that these settlements were very much integral to Chennai, right? And this idea of periphery is this, could this then be, misappropriated through this rhetorics of, eco-restoration, for example, to justify, for instance, resettlement, right? So, did you see any dangers of conceptualizing it this way, or could this very powerful notion of a corridor can be used in a different way as an integral part of Chennai, which could be more helpful?
Thanks. My questions to Anamika. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually know Hilda. She taught me as well. I studied in Leuven. So, the couple of images that I saw of your, say, a picture of Gurgaon, where you're talking about like the city is growing and the spaces in between the buildings, the streets are still catching up. So that is still, there is a mismatch there, and there usually, we are blaming that there is a state involved in the middle, and there is a problem in that, and the people are not connected, they're not in places. There also the same image exists. The buildings are posher, they are more richer, and the streets are still not there yet. But then there the scenario is the people are not, again, like they're not the working people, they are actually influential, they are better off, they have a very good connection with the political system, they can influence. So I am trying to figure out why the change is not happening there also, or could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Thanks.
So to Larita, about entrenchment, and to Charlotte as well. So again, thanks for asking me to speak more on that one. I think I see entrenchment, or I'm defining it as something that involves shifting maneuvers, very much temporally, not only spatially, but temporally varied kinds of strategies that comprise this. So, I talked about in Wood Wharf, it's about building and, really densifying the economic networks, the industrial sort of infrastructure of that place without bothering about the pattas. They know they have no chance of getting pattas. That doesn't figure in their entrenchment strategies. In the central city area where they have got pattas, but are still under risks of being displaced because of eco-restoration projects or whatever, it is about marking themselves as mainstream citizens of the city through, respectability and cultural sort of assertions. A lot of this sort of, distancing themselves from sort of Dalit dialogue and that kind of strategies. They're about cultural assertions. And in the South, which this comes to your question, it is about shifting from already sort of footholds that have already been gained in the center city to moving out and recreating the sort of hard cycle of squatting and incremental construction, because you're entering, and here's where the entrenchment and worlding comes together, you want to enter the circuits of property ownership through squatting, and so I think it shifts, it changes, it's not, and entrenchment is often also about getting up and moving in search of a different kind of, urban future, and in with a different drive of urbanization that is taking place along this corridor. But I'm tracing all of this along a corridor. It just happened in my case that it's a very neat sort of a thing that I get, because even the resettlement colonies are along this corridor. That may not be incidental, but it might be. So I need to do a lot more work to look at what those water's edge urbanisms can be in different cities and different contexts. But in my case, it writes itself. So, yeah.
So I got two questions. I think I can connect them easily. The first, Saundarya's question about aspirational lifestyle. I think this is sort of what Ruet et al. Talks about in her study of Chennai. That the mental patterning of urbanity comes probably before the materiality comes. And I mean, I wouldn't say that the aspirational sort of, this mental patterning defines the peri-urban in any way. But yeah, it's sort of something to be looked at, and I haven't really studied it. But then when I go to the honor question about, whether the honor is changing, what is the notion of it? I think honor is sort of an anthropological subject, but within anthropology, it is a really sort of feminist anthropology subject, because any context I see of honor in South Asia, it is always traced down to the control over women's body. So every kind of honor I sort of see it as ending in that notion. And when you talk about this changing of a notion of honor, is it changing or is it not? Is it reacting to urbanization like the way urbanization is reacting to it? I would say certainly yes. As I said about this aspirational thing, Saundarya asked, there is a mental patterning, and there is, I mean, it is a very negotiable thing. There is a commensurability in it. Honor sort of coexists with the economic language of capital in sort of negotiating the land market. And it is certainly changing. I mean, it is just deep work that needs to be done, but it is really dynamic. I mean, it is probably one person violates it, and if he is powerful, he changes the norm for others.
I'll begin with the first question that you raised about peri-urban. If you saw the title of my presentation, on purpose, my title says suburb to global, and it doesn't say suburb to global city, Gurgaon. It's because I don't know if it is peri-urban, the definition you're asking, that when do we stop calling Gurgaon as peri-urban, because I somehow feel that it is just not, like we were just discussing, that it is just not material, that like the city is built now, so now it is a city. But I also feel that there are various processes, like for example, social and cultural processes that are still in transition. Like for example, the case of Nathapur, as I say, these urban villages, they are in the fabric, they are in the material of urban, but they are still facing, they're still in the transformation of becoming global villages. So for me it is difficult. I mean, I guess that is the difficulty we have, that if it is already urban, I don't see it be, I can't name Gurgaon still a global city. I still see it as a globalizing suburb. So that is where I stand here. And with respect to interstitial spaces, and I'll cover both the questions raised. So what I understand by interstitial spaces is that you see Gurgaon city and you see it, I mean, even you just Google Gurgaon and you will see high rises and all these big projects. So what happens is that even in spatial, the presence is a lot. It's all privatized cities. This is what you see. But then what happens that there are in between spaces, like urban villages is one part of it, but as he was trying to mention, that streets, for example, so I did not cover it in my presentation, but I am also reading this in-between street spaces as interstices of these development, and I'm trying to understand. So today's case was only about urban villages, but if I talk about streets, they are so interesting, because if you see a city like, a global, like Gurgaon, you always look into the privatized city, which is gated, and there is the villages, and they are dominant. You don't see any contestation within the privatized city or the urban villages or slums. The contestations happen when they come on the streets, when they come in, a space where everyone shares their economic growth. For example, on streets, you have, the street is developed by DLF. I was working on the master plan. Then there are urban villages who want space to open their bars, and then we have street vendors who live in the village, but they are kind of informally occupying the space. So for me, these spaces, these streets are very interesting, and that's part of my PhD research too. So within the framework of interstitial spaces, I'm trying to study the street too. So, yeah.
So I'm going to actually ask to end with Chavi's response.
Answering your question first, when I talked about how there have been transitions, so right from the time when they started, like first class taxis and second class taxis. So what the state had actually proposed is that first class taxis would be more of the luxury vehicles, and the smaller ones, the second class would be the smaller ones. And accordingly, their fare was supposed to be different. So say one was running at 4 anna a mile, the other was running at 8 anna a mile, double the price. Now what happened was that because it was being run by fleets, these companies, these big companies, could actually get the same cars for the lesser one, which was the second class taxis. And that is how the second class taxis at one point of time were crowding out the first class taxis and basically encroaching on the livelihood of those taxi drivers. So that is how at one point of time there was a big struggle to actually bring down the rates to 4 anna, but at the same time incentivize the drivers. That eventually led to phasing out of the first class taxis because they were not considered economically viable. Now light taxis and baby taxis also came in the same spirit. And every time these taxis, including almost up to the point of 2007, which is the introduction of fleet taxis, what we see is that every time another category of taxi was being introduced, one, their numbers were being capped. State was introducing. So ultimately the state was being the regulator, and in any kind of arbitration that was required, any kind of negotiation, people who were wanting to contest it knew that, okay, we have to go here and contest. This is where our voices will be heard. Now what is happening right now is the numbers are increasing in proportions that nobody had imagined. Now, because that is the case, the encroachment on livelihood is at a much faster pace. Now, addressing to the state, they have been doing it for the past 2 years, and it is so fraught because somewhere they know that now the actual decision makers, they don't even know whether it's the center who is actually making the decisions. Because, for example, Startup India event had Travis Kalanick as a speaker, had Bhavesh Agarwal, who owns Ola, as a speaker, but taxi drivers, or for that matter unions, whether from Delhi, Bangalore, Bombay, anywhere, they were not even part of the audience because it was a startup event. You have to project a certain image of the entire country and as well as the city. So that is why this sentiment is widespread that after a point they would not be heard, and maybe this time they will actually be wiped out. And for them actually now thinking of taking on to some other occupation is something they cannot think of because they have always lived their life with the sense of dignity, autonomy, and the fact that they always have this public service vehicle authorization badge. Every taxi driver, actually taxi drivers who have shifted from Kalipili to Meru and are now even working in Ola Uber, they say that at times this idea that we were at one point of time public servants brought to us a lot of self-esteem and a position in the neighborhood, in the city, as well as the villages from where they come. So that seems to be disrupted in a big way, and that is where I feel that, yeah, there is a transition, but what definitely marks out this transition this time is the very fraught nature of how state can intervene in any kind of negotiation. And yeah, coming to your point, I actually interviewed, because I started my project with Kalipili taxi drivers. So yeah, those interviews are far more in number as compared to the Uber, Ola drivers. But I have interviewed, and some of the interviews I have done with people who started off as auto rickshaw drivers, moved on to Kalipili once they got their badges, because auto is still like a lot of so-called Nalla drivers without badges actually are able to drive the autos. So they moved on to metered taxis. When the fleet taxis came in, they actually adopted that because in the beginning, the incentives in Meru and tab cabs was also very high, and as against the investment that they were making into. And now they have transitioned to Ola or Uber. And there was this one driver, very interesting case to study, who actually has an Uber app, an Ola app, and also a Meru app. And he says that I know, and he is definitely like towards the end of his 50s, and he is saying that now I have earned enough. So in a process, if the thing is that in case Uber shuts, Ola shuts, Meru shuts, I actually can wrap up my entire thing and go back to my village. His house, like his family still resides there. But apart from the very good stories, which are plenty right now, even the paper that I read very recently on the Bangalore work actually brings out this thing that right now drivers, people who actually never thought that they could make it big in the informal economy through these channels are actually thinking that maybe there's a possibility for making it big and having a lot of self-esteem in the process. But now what some of the drivers who are driving in Ola, Uber, and for that matter also unions, and what the taxi drivers with metered cabs are saying is that after a point, if you see a 10-year span, right now the thing that there is no cap in terms of entry. So the numbers are escalating fast. So at what point, at what stage will the business of Uber and Ola plateau off? And then when that plateaus off, what is it, how is it that it will impact that one taxi driver who actually sold maybe a property in village to buy a car here and become a driver partner here? Also, what has happened is that a lot of people, it's not that every time the driver is owning the car. In Bombay, what I've come across is that there are drivers who are working for 16,000, 18,000, and they're working for 16 hours in a day, which actually takes a toll on their health if they see a long span. And a long span here is just as short as 1.5 months. Some of them have been hospitalized with spine issues because just to make more of incentive, because like incentive is on like per ride basis. So if you are actually able to do 9 rides in a day, they actually give you 5,500 rupees for that day. Uber gives, this is what the Uber structure is right now for this particular driver. So he says that after a point of time, his brother actually landed up with a spine issue because of that. So there are questions of health, there are questions of taxi drivers' rights, their voices, how they are treated as a labor, as a very critical labor in the city, which has always, they have always been ignored, and the entire issue of invisibility has always been there, whether I talk about state, whether I talk about the private players coming in. But what I feel is that they just make the invisibility aspect, the right aspect more acute with their coming in, because we don't know what exactly is the agenda there. And somewhere the agenda is definitely driven by high return of the money that they are right now getting.
Thank you so much. Thank you, actually, everybody on the panel. I think it's been a really interesting set of discussions. Thank you all for staying a lot beyond lunchtime. So, I mean, I think we should carry on to the lunch thing, and then we're going to regroup here for the in about 45 minutes for the closing panel. So, thanks again.